Hello, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ugo Stornaiolo, and tonight we're recording a new episode, the 10th episode of this series of videos for España Navarra Confidencial. As you know, I'm your host, and this is En Orden, Libertad, or not so weekly, not so program of free dissertations on any topic in English, French, Spanish, as it should be most of the time. This time it's in English, and on many topics. Today, I'm joined by J. Patrick Higgins, who is an American researcher working at the University of Łódź in Poland, and who is quite an expert on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So, welcome, J. Patrick.
Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, I don't know if how much you have to research to qualify as an expert, but it is the subject of my main work. So glad to be here.
I mean, um, the fact that you are one of the very few people who have written on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in English kind of makes you an expert. So there
Yeah,
it goes.
that's true. There's like 12 of us worldwide or something, so it's a pretty small club, I guess, so to speak.
All right, so we should begin with some introduction for our audience about who you are and how you ended up in Poland, because most people are really amazed by the fact that there are people here in Poland working on non-Polish stuff who speak English and who are not Polish. So, what's your story? How did you end up in Woods, and why did you end up researching about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth?
Yeah, so it's kind of somewhat of a long story, but I did my PhD. I did my master's work at the Mickiewitz Center at George Mason University under Pete Betke, who did his work kind of under the fall of the Soviet Union. And the subject of my work was to answer the question: why has Poland been relatively successful in transitioning away from communism over the last 30 years, whereas other places like, unfortunately, like Ukraine or Belarus, we middle, Kazakhstan, the Central Europe, Asian countries, why have they been less successful? And so the two broad strands of the literature, kind of the two broad explanations was one, Ronald Reagan won the Cold War because he outspent him and NATO, and East Western Europe, they outspent the communists until they ran out of money. And the second kind of explanation was that communism kind of collapsed from within because it was kind of a rotten structure and it got too big and kind of its own weight dragged it down. And they're not mutually exclusive, but I kind of didn't really like either of those explanations because they really didn't give any agency to the people who lived actually under communism. What did the Polish people think about communism? Did the Polish people actually reject or accept communism? Did it connect with Polish culture? And there's kind of a very famous quote, kind of anecdote by Stalin. We're not sure if he actually said it or if it's kind of an invention, that introducing communism to Poland is like trying to put a saddle on a cow instead of putting a saddle on a horse, right? And that's why they were kind of so brutal in trying to oppress Poland and try to force it into the regime. And so basically my research is actually a kind of a coin flip between when I want you to look at Poland or Hungary, because those are kind of the two big standout examples. Now, the last 5 or 6 years, it's become a little more complicated. I don't know if we want to jump into that. That's kind of a different topic with democracy here in Poland and Hungary. But what I found was this interesting pattern that if you look at the countries who have generally been most successful, so Poland, Hungary, and the Baltic states, they actually had the longest period or a lot of periods where they would, have uprisings or revolts. Or of course, you could have the old Czechoslovakia, so Czech Republic and Slovakia as well, where they would have revolts against the Russians. And if you look back, during the Russian Empire or the Austrian Empire, when they tried to rule this part of Central Europe, there was constant rebellions, constant uprisings. So my kind of hypothesis was that communism failed in Poland because it had shallow roots, because the Poles never accepted it, because they saw this as kind of, Russian imperialism 2.0. And that's kind of what I was doing. And so I was looking at some of this literature. So, for example, there's this Swedish think he's Swedish, pretty sure he's Swedish, economist, Anders Aslund, has this whole book about several books, how capitalism was built, and I think another one's The Building of Capitalism, about this transformation. And he basically argued that communist countries tried to sabotage the transformation in the late 80s. They knew that they were losing power, and so a lot of them, they tried to sabotage the transformation with the idea is that they would be out of power for one or two election cycles, and then the situation would be so bad that the people would vote them back in. And that's kind of what we've actually seen in Russia, today, where it's the same old KGB guys just kind of have taken over again, or something like Belarus, where Lukashenko kind of rose there. But I kind of had this thought was, if the institutions at the end of communism shaped post-communism, then by that same logic, the institutions before communism should shape whether or not communism was accepted or not. And we've kind of had this idea that the Eastern Bloc was kind of a unified piece, and it really wasn't. So there's a lot of deviations kind of throughout. And so that's kind of the research that I did for my master's work at Mercatus, and I was interested in doing a PhD in a similar subject, and just not a lot of people were interested in this in the United States. And so I sent a bunch of emails randomly to professors in kind of Germany and Poland. And my idea was originally, I'll take a year or two off, spend some time in the archives, look at the kind of transition away from communism kind of stuff, do a few years of that, and then I'll try again for a PhD in the US. And so I found this place in Poland. They were the only ones who really took me seriously. And they said, we've actually just published a book. And their book was actually similar theme, but it actually started from the Magna Carta. And it was saying that there is this kind of Eastern European tradition of freedom and liberalism and individualism, relative tolerance, etc., that's been ignored. And so there is kind of parallels that were made, 15th century, 12th century, 13th century, 15th century, etc., here in Central Eastern Europe that were made in other places. So mine was kind of a more modern extension of what they were doing. So they invited me to come, and they said, look, you have to come here. I sent them my master's thesis. They read it, and within like a week, they said, we're coming here. We're giving you an offer. We're going to, you can take Polish classes, so you learn the language. And so my first year, I kind of did this hybrid thing where I took Polish classes during the day, and all my classes were at night, and all my research was at night. And that's why I'm here. Here I am. So that's kind of a 5-minute summary of kind of the work that I did. And my PhD work just went even deeper and deeper, where I start now from around the 14th century, and it goes from 14th century-ish to 1791, Constitution of May. So that's the kind of arc that I covered.
So you pretty much, the story, and especially how you kind of begin by comparing Poland and Hungary, which seem to be at the spotlight when it comes to the successes of a certain conservative right outside of the US. It's interesting because right now we see that there's a lot of interest, especially in Hungary, not so much in Poland, because of the war in Ukraine. And you have Hungary being taken as this example of the ones who are not really complying with NATO and with military-industrial complex, and Poland being more of an active player in that dynamic. But then again, you also have the thing that Hungary, especially up to very recently, was run by a different kind of monarchy than what Poland was run before the partitions. The partitions themselves are also a quite interesting subject. As far as I also live in Poland, so I do know my stuff. Not many people realize that the Polish system was quite well. It was quite an example of how things were different in this part of the world,
Right, yeah.
unlike what you had in France, in Spain, in England. And I wanted to talk to you about that because it's not really something we are able to understand in the rest of the West. In Latin America, we have no idea about this. In Spain, very traditional circles might be aware. In the US and in the United Kingdom, there's a real strong bias towards classical liberalism and towards either the constitutional republic or to constitutional monarchy. And so these kind of examples that we see in Polish history, they seem to go the other way, especially because it's a completely different constitutional tradition.
Yeah,
Well, you on on the basis of the 14th century. And for those who don't know, that was the time in which Poland became an electoral monarchy. So I wanted to ask you more about that kind of institution, because the other example we know of is the Holy Roman Empire, and around the same time, the Holy
yeah,
Roman Empire became de facto hereditary, whereas Poland became electoral.
yeah. Well, it's electoral kind of in quotes because they also had a habit of always electing the son of the king anyway. So it's like whenever there was a break in the dynasty, yes, they had an electoral process, but it was like 9 times out of 10, it was the king. And if the king died without children, they would pass it to his younger brother or his nephew. So it's kind of in between. But what's so fascinating about Poland and why I think, so I'll back up a little bit. So I think the misconceptions that a lot of people, even with Poland, have today is that when Poland was taken over by the partitions, it was taken over by the strong, centralized, uh, uh, imperial tradition, right? So Austrian, Habsburg Austria, right? You had Prussia and you had Russia, and they created legal systems. They created this, inquisitional legal system, right? They had strong relationships between the king and the church. It was absolutism. They had legal codes. And so a lot of people say, oh, well, Poland has always been in this family of civil law. They try to draw this link from Rome through the civil law to Poland. And that's just not true. It's just kind of this historical fiction from 18th century onward where these kind of institutions were put on Poland by force. So not to get too deep into it, but I think a lot of the tensions we have in Poland is because Poland kind of had its own, I don't want to put them say that they were common law, but they kind of had this kind of bottom up, very strong movements throughout for 1,000 years of their history. And the last 300 years has been this trying to force externally, whether by the Habsburgs or the Soviets or whomever, maybe now tensions with the EU. And I think that's kind of like this deep, cultural problem or constitutional identity or however you want to phrase it. So that kind of component is there. But to kind of go to the original point, so the creation of Poland Lithuania and the monarchy was kind of a fascinating situation because there was a group in Poland around the 9th century. The Piast dynasty started kind of close to the geographical boundaries of Poland today, right? And they kind of declined over several hundred years, and they broke up into several small fragment states. And one of these gentlemen, one of these dukes, had this great idea of he wanted to kind of launch a crusade against the pagans because the Lithuanians, the Prussian tribe, and all the people in the Baltic were all pagans. So he says, this is how I'm going to reunite everybody. I'm going to get the support from the Holy Roman Empire and from the church and all these things and use it to kind of rebuild the kingdom of Poland, right, kind of as a pretense through this way. And so they invited this group of Germanic knights who were actually from the Crusades originally. They were in Jerusalem. They kind of lost and got kicked out of Jerusalem and were homeless for a while. And they made their way to Poland. And when they got to Poland, instead of helping him in his crusade, they turned the crusade against the Poles as well. And it was actually under the blessings of the Pope as well as the Roman Empire. So this whole, where northern Poland is, up through Lithuania, so Gdańsk and all this area was controlled by these Germanic Teutonic Knights, which eventually evolves into Prussia, 250 or whatever, years later. But what was kind of unique is that the Poles and the Lithuanians, even though the Poles were Christian by that point, for 300 some odd years of being Christian, and the Lithuanians were pagan, they both had a common enemy against the Germanic Knights, who were also Christian. So back at the time in medieval Europe, it was kind of like Christians had to work together against pagans, against heathens, or whatever. And Poland said, no, 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 no. And they actually built an alliance between the Poles and the Lithuanians against the Germans, right? And so if you look at, for example, just war theory, Pavel of Skarbimir and all these guys, like these Polish guys in the 13th century, a little bit earlier, they kind of had justifications of, what is a just war and individual freedom. You can't force people to convert. And this was in a direct reaction to the Germanic tribes invading them. And so because Poland had a very weak system of kings, they had this very strong system of knights who eventually evolved into the nobility. But they basically said, we'll work together with you. We'll give you taxes. We'll support you. Building your army will fight for you as long as you give us rights. So Poland, very much from the beginning, was kind of this bottom-up kind of approach, where so it was this interesting combination of the knights were slowly transforming into the nobility, and they were kind of creating parliamentary institutions along the way, where they would have a formal meeting and they would give their demands to the king, right? And then there's also this alliance between Poles and the Lithuanians. And by the way, from the history of the church point of view, this conciliaries movement, which is kind of this idea that the Pope was not all powerful, right? And so there should be this kind of the original idea of early Christianity. There should be a council of all the different bishops should rule instead of the king was absolute king. That was kind of very popular in Poland, right? So anyway, make the story shorter. Over 100 years or so, Poland and Lithuania got closer and closer together, and then eventually they solidified that together in a monarchy, kind of a dual monarchy, where they had the Grand Duke of Lithuania, who was a guy named Jogaila, and then he became Vladislav, who we know today, Vladislav II, and he married the Queen of Poland.
Jadwiga.
Jadwiga, right, yeah. And then she actually died. I think she had a daughter, and she and her daughter died in childbirth, but he was like 40 and she was like 14 or something when they got married. She died basically in childbirth. And then his second wife that he remarried was actually, he had several wives. I think his second one was actually Lithuanian, and I think another one was German or something like that. But his second one was Lithuanian. But he said, hey, in exchange for keeping the kingdoms together, because he was not Polish, right? So the Polish nobles distrusted him. He says, we will create this system of elected monarchy that so long as my dynasty, the Jagiellonian dynasty, me and my descendants, so long as we respect the rights of the nobles, you allow us to kind of remain as your king, right? So it was kind of a very different, because of it wasn't like France where, it's one kind of centralized power outward, where the geographical boundaries of France have more or less been the same since Roman Gaul, right? And same thing with Germania, right? The Germans have always had this vision of, Holy Roman Empire, then the, Union of Germany and Prussia and all these things like that, of kind of rebuilding Germania, right? The same dimensions that the Italians had. Poland was kind of very much all these little tiny states slowly kind of banded together over time. And we kind of see that reflected in the constitutional structure, the political structure, the elected monarchy. Even though the king was Catholic, they had a lot of respect for Jews, for Muslims. They had Muslims from Armenia, was also a big group here. At one point, because of the unrest between England and Scotland, they actually had a lot of Scottish merchants who were living in Poland around the Baltic Sea. They had a kind of little merchant colony up there, in the 16th century. 15th and 16th century, right? So the whole evolutionary process of Polish law, I think, has a lot of parallels. For example, how England, was lots of small countries, supposedly it was 7 kingdoms, right, that they eventually came together. The United States was, 13 colonies that came together, and other places, with kind of more federalist or states, kind of central form of government. Right, and it kind of happened somewhat organically over the course of Polish history, and then later Polish-Lithuanian history.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of wraps the whole idea of how Polish tradition, at least when it comes to the spirit of its laws, was as similar but as different as it could be in the rest of Europe. And this is something I realized studying law here. I just like to learn about Polish constitutional history as kind of a hobby, because there is not something I am really studying, doing comparative law. But the fact that you still have a lot of institutions that come back to at least to that era of history makes it very, very interesting, especially because you don't get to learn about it in the rest of, I don't know, the West. You have this bias towards, I don't know, the Enlightenment theory in England, in France, and the result of that is that you get very centralizing institutions, and you get very centralized states. That might be one of the issues with Hungary as well these days. You have the extreme centralization in Budapest, but in Poland, still up to this day, you don't have those issues. Of course, you have the thing about Warsaw being the capital and the seat of government, but you see still on the economic level a lot of decentralization. You see how there's a certain amount of independence between institutions, between the powers of government, uh, separation of powers, that kind of stuff. I mean, a lot of people will say no, the current government is centralizing and they're overtaking courts and parliament and everything. And the fact that you still have a very strong opposition here, which doesn't really happen in the rest of Europe, kind
Yeah.
of proves the point wrong. I mean, that's one of the ideas. On the other side, you see that Polish, I don't know if you have realized that, but there's some kind of continuity, even if some institutions disappear, between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the First Republic, as they call it, the Second Republic, the one that was created by Piłsudski, and the current one. The odd one out, and I take this point back from what you said at the beginning, the odd one out in the whole system was the communist Soviet one, because there was no legal or no historical, not any kind of symbolic continuity between, the legitimate Polish governments and the communist one. So maybe you could add some comments on that. What makes the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth a strong basis for even up today for legitimacy in power, and what made the communist government to kind of crumble over time?
Yeah, so what's kind of interesting is that actually one of the things that Poland did, as other kind of places, right, because Pilsudski, right, he also had this kind of, strange combination of nationalism, authoritarianism, and some socialist kind of ideas, kind of, like Bismarck or some of the others thinkers at that time. Well, not continuation of that kind of Bismarck tradition, so to speak. Um, but what's interesting was that there was a kind of a homegrown communist movement within Poland, of course, as well. And when the Nazis came and they invaded Poland, there were some of them who thought that Russia would be on Poland's side, and it didn't work out that well for them either. And one of the things that Stalin actually did was he actually kind of killed off or exiled all of the kind of the domestic communist or socialist or labor union kind of persons here in Poland as well. So that was also kind of something kind of problematic. And so I've kind of thought as kind of an alternative hypothesis: would communism have been more successful in Poland if they hadn't killed off kind of their own homegrown Polish communists who might have been able to kind of facilitate the kind of institutions here in Poland as well? But it's really kind of fascinating. I don't remember the exact number, but for example, if you look at by the mid 1970s and the early 1980s, it's something like 75% to 80% of all economic activity in Poland was actually on the black market, right? So even 25 years or something before communism, it was kind of somehow already kind of a sham, right? And so some of my professors, for example, kind of tell me a funny story of when they were kids and they used to collect Coca-Cola bottles as kind of like a black, and they'd take the bottle tops as kind of like this black market currency, right? Where they were so valuable and all these things like that. And so I think very early on within the communist period, Poland, it wasn't going to work. And so what the interesting thing also was that Stalin kind of came to Poland kind of last, and they were kind of rebuilding Poland, and he was trying to make changes, but then he died before he completed the so-called Stalinization of Poland versus in Central Europe or Belarus or Ukraine or places like that, which he had a much heavier Georgia, right, much heavier hand. And so if he had lived another 5-10 years, maybe it would have also been different because he would have been able to have kind of a deeper grasp kind of on the institutions that he did. So it's kind of like he tried to impose it. They didn't like it. They kind of found internal ways of of resisting it, so to speak. They kind of had a very strong black market. The other thing to think about too is that Poland, the strongest political power, next to the probably the strongest de facto political power, was always the Catholic Church, right? And so, how many other communist countries? It's kind of like, can we imagine China today having any church be, kind of the power, and the communist government in Poland actually was afraid to, go against the church because they know that the population would revolt, right? So, and I'm not exactly an expert in this period, so I couldn't tell you, but, something happened in the sense where, all the other clergy, the communists in other countries were more successful at either co-opting or killing off the clergy, but they just never, that Stalinization, kind of elimination, liquidation of the clergy, never really happened in Poland, right? And the church kind of stayed strong. And so, when the number one or number two institution in your country is ardently anti-communist, how really communist are you? Are you communist in name only, but on the ground, real life, day-to-day activities? I think it's harder to say, to be honest.
Well, speaking of the church, I want to ask you about the role of the church in the Commonwealth, because that kinds to be overlooked or put at odds with the churches and with the institutions of the Golden Freedoms, in the sense that, I mean, the phrase that goes that Poland was a paradise for the Jews, and how the whole canard goes, right? That it was a paradise for the Jews, heaven for the nobility, purgatory for the bourgeois, for the bourgeoisie, and hell for the peasants. And that was kind of also pushed by the church during the time of the Commonwealth, especially because of the counter reform, because Poland was not really following the counter reform, and they were accepting a lot of exiles from Germany, especially Protestants. At one point, Poland even had a Protestant king who converted to Catholicism later, from the Wettin dynasty. Right? I even think that the Swedish Vasa kings were also Protestant around the time they were kings of Poland. I am not sure about that.
So the Vasa family was Protestant, but the branch that lived in Poland was actually Catholic, because that's why he got kicked out of Sweden, because he was Catholic while the Reformation was going on, and that's actually what kind of led to the chaos, and in my view, the real decline of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the mid-17th century, was because you had this Catholic king who was very pro-Catholic, but he was also Swedish. He was half Polish, half Sweden, and that kind of opened up a whole bunch of problems. But for the first 100 or so years of the country, you're right, it was not very strongly Catholic, and so it's kind of really interesting, kind of as we mentioned before, right? So Poland was kind of always very suspicious of the church, because the main historical enemy of Poland all the way back to the Middle Ages was the Germanic tribes, and then the Holy Roman Empire, which were hyper-Catholic. So Poland, on one hand, was a Catholic country, but on the other hand, they didn't want to become another province of the Holy Roman Empire. So therefore, they kind of kept the church at a distance, so to speak. And there's always kind of these tensions with the church and the country. But so, for example, what's interesting is that Lithuania actually became very strongly Calvinist. And so, some of the most powerful families of Lithuania, the Radicado family, were Calvinists, and they actually were supporters of a lot of these radical, the Socinians or Arians or anti-Trinitarians or whatever you want, Trinitarians, however you want to phrase them, the Polish Brethren Church or the Reformed Minor Church, as they call themselves. A lot of them kind of settled actually in Lithuanian lands rather than kind of Polish lands. And the other thing we also don't think about is that a significant part of the population was Orthodox, because Poland stretched all the way, so like kind of where Lviv is in Ukraine today, kind of over. So Lviv was a city actually built by Poland, and it was part of Poland until after the First World War, right? And so that whole parts of what is now Belarus, right, the western kind of third, so to speak, of Ukraine, right, were part of Poland. So there's significant populations which were Orthodox as well. So it's like, Poland was this thing where it's like, maybe a third of it was Catholic, maybe 10% of it was Jewish, and then you had, 20% of it was this group, 20% was that group, and so it wasn't really unified in that sense. And so, it was kind of really interesting is that actually, uh, by the time that we had the 16th century, and the so-called golden age of Poland, where we had Zygmunt the First the Old and Zygmunt II, August, the kind of kings that right there, the last of the Jagiellonian kings. At the time, Prussia, the Holy Germanic, the Germanic Knights had been pushed back to Prussia, and they are basically a client state of Poland. And the king, or the leader of this kind of Germanic order, was Albrecht. Albrecht, it's just Polish, so Albert, right? So Albrecht, right? He actually converted, but I can't remember his exact relationship, but he was either the nephew or like cousin once removed by marriage of actually the Polish king. And so it was actually the Polish kings who said, don't worry, you can convert to Lutheranism, and we're going to not let the Holy Roman Empire, anybody kind of mess with you. So it was actually the Polish kings who were kind of doing this thing. And so one of the big reform movements that kind of led actually up to the creation of the Henrician Articles and all that stuff in 1573 were actually, they call themselves the executionists, or the execution of law movement. And they actually basically said, the king and the church has been misusing these laws, and they actually gathered a political faction in parliament to make it so that the clergy could not have secular courts, or clergy decisions from clerical courts could not be executed by agents of the king, right? So there's kind of a separation of the secular versus regular religious legal systems. And that a lot of the people of that movement were actually either Protestants themselves, or they were Catholics who were known to be kind of very moderate and very kind of sympathetic towards this idea of moderate kind of form of Catholicism, right? And so for example, there was a while in Poland where the Jesuits were not allowed to come to Poland because they saw the Jesuits as kind of foreign aliens of servants of either France or the Habsburgs or whoever who would kind of infiltrate society, and they were kind of opposed to that. So when the Counter-Reformation was happening everywhere else, it didn't happen in Poland. And there are several times, you kind of mentioned the Vasa king, this very strong Catholic Vasa king. He actually wanted to jump into the 30 Years' War, and the nobility actually said no, and they blocked raising of his taxes because they weren't going to jump in on that, right? And so there has been this very strong kind of push against them, kind of interesting. And one of the main components of the 1573 Henrician Articles, which is actually, so Poland and Lithuania were a dual monarchy, but they actually became a dual nation in 1573 because the last Zygmunt August was dying without children. He knew he was the last Jagiellonian, and he wanted to preserve the union after his death. So they created this thing called the Union of Lublin in 1569, and he basically said, we are creating this constitution, this union between the two countries, and everybody, all the members of the nobility, had to swear to kind of preserve the union, so to speak. And one of the things that they swore to was, they would elect a king, they would kind of make sure that he followed the laws, and one of the laws was separation of church and state, essentially. And this kind of achievements that they actually won, and that was codified in 1569 as well as in 1573, officially, in the first quote unquote constitutions of the first Commonwealth. So the first Commonwealth, the Union, kind of started in the 14th century. I want to say something like 1385 was the marriage between Jadwiga and Jagiełło, and by that, so it was kind of this informal union for 100 plus years. But by 1573, they had an actual written kind of constitutional document which had freedom of religion as kind of a core value within the text.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at the foundational documents of the post-Lithuanian Commonwealth, I would consider Henrik and Argyll, which were like a charter, a granted charter. You had the Union of Lublin, which is a kind of basic constitution alongside the Henrican Articles, and you have the Warsaw Confederation that grants freedom and tolerance for religious diversity and for all the sects that were not Catholic. When you look at these documents, the nobility gets a really central role, not only in their electoral role as electors of a new king or a new dynasty when the king dies or when the dynasty dies out. They also get a lot of these powers. And for some authors and for some scholars, this is also one of the reasons of the decline of Polish Lithuania, of Poland, Lithuania, because they got so powerful and they got so influential that they could challenge the king itself at different moments, and they could raise armies. They could raise these confederations, confederacja, as it was called, the right under Polish law, and they would go against the king, and they would be easily influenced by foreign powers, which is pretty much what caused the partitions at the end of the 18th century. So you already talked about the church as an influential player, but what about the nobility? Because the nobility, it's pretty much the usual suspect when it comes to the decline of Poland, Lithuania, instead of what happened in other countries in which they were kept in check by even more powerful kings during absolutism.
Yeah. So I would kind of say, to start off with, there's this kind of problem in the historiography, I would argue, where we know how the story ended, right? That we know that the country collapsed. So in some sense, it's kind of unfair to kind of, with the knowledge of hindsight, kind of blame the nobles for it, because they were doing what they thought was good for the country at the time. So kind of say, it's like, oh, well, it collapsed, 1772 was the first partition, then 1791, 1795, all these problems that they had, or 1792, 1795, all these problems. But to say, what the guy was doing in 1608, somehow inevitably led to the kind of the seeds. It's kind of, this like, teleological argument where it's like, oh, well, all the, where we look at the seeds of the destruction earlier. And I think that's kind of a mistake to make in the first hand. And the other one, we kind of touched upon this earlier, is that we, especially in the West, kind of have, and Western Europe more so than the United States, I would kind of add, we kind of see this natural continuity, right? Where you had the Roman Empire, you had the Greeks who created civilization, and they were too chaotic, right? So they kind of failed. And then the Romans kind of perfected it, right? And that was the peak of civilization. And then every other kingdom beforehand tried to somehow emulate what the Romans did, Holy Roman Empire, all the, France tried to do it, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this kind of bias where we see centralization of political power, and especially in combination with the power of the king and the church, kind of as the successful model of quote unquote the modern state. And so because Poland didn't have a centralized power, somehow it's bad or it's failed or whatever. So these are kind of two historical and graphical errors. But if you look, for example, the United States or England, for much of their history, they didn't have a centralized king. And for the last part of 300 so years, the strongest countries in the world have been the United States or Great Britain. And also, you look at all the alternative countries. So, for example, like the Netherlands, right? The Netherlands or Belgium were kind of a fusion of smaller states, right? They kind of have their own kind of federalist models. So I think this idea of, empire, centralized state, therefore enlightenment and modernity is kind of an idea that needs to be kind of be challenged. And so that's kind of the background I would state kind of with the Schlachta. The other thing that's interesting, or the nobility, right, is that compared to other countries, Poland actually had a very high number, very high percentage of the population that were actually what we consider to be nobility. So it's like some people say it's between 8 to 12% of the population were nobles, right? And so for them, it was actually a legal status and not really kind of an economic status or anything like that. So you did have these super powerful, they call them the magnates, Schlachta, who many times were actually more powerful than the king, who had their own private armies. But you could also have a guy who was basically noble and title only, who still had voting rights, one person, one vote, even though he had no, real economic power or wasn't the military power for for himself. And so Poland actually had this thing where they called it, the in virtum election, where in theory, every time the king could be elected, every nobleman could assemble from all over the country, and they would all have one person, one vote to summon the king, right? And so, and if we think about it in this way, when we look at the founding of the United States, right, only about 15 to 20% of the population of the United States could vote. Where there were land-owning wealthy white men who could vote. So if you look at Poland in 1600, where they have 10% of the population who can vote as citizens, at the United States, where they had between 50 to 20% of people who could vote as citizens, it's actually not that large of a gap, so to speak. And so what I would kind of argue from the other hand is that I think a lot of Polish people have pointed this out. I think a lot of Polish historians, political scientists, the chief problem of Poland versus the United States is that of geography. So, when the United States had a civil war, we weren't worried about Canada invading us, right? We were kind of able to deal with all these kind of crises or kind of tensions within ourselves and kind of work it out and then come out stronger for it. Or like in England, right? England had the Channel. So when they had the War of the Roses, they were able to fight it out and they didn't have to worry about them getting invaded. Every time there was a dynastic problem or a question or a struggle within Poland, the Russians, the Swedes, the Germans, the Austrians, the Hungarians, whoever, they all try to invade simultaneously. So, it's kind of unfair to be like, oh, well, it's their fault. It's like maybe from their own perspective, they were, fighting for their own rights and then wanted a limited government, things that we would consider to be good today. But they were just in a bad context, where, they did want this more decentralized government. And when you're the only guy who wants a decentralized government, and then not a permanent army, by the way, next to empires who all have centralized government and empires, and they're all expanding towards you, how much is that your fault in some sense, or kind of this problem of the accident of history, so to speak. So yes, there were a lot of problems, right? So for example, you mentioned the Wettin king, right? Who was German prince who became Catholic. Essentially, the Wettin kings, they actually had an election where he was not elected king. And he kind of sailed his fleet and basically said, well, now I'm taking over the country anyway. So in some sense, the Wettin dynasty was kind of a coup. And after so many years of decline and civil war, Poland basically the nobles couldn't get together and kind of force the king out. And also, he happened to have an agreement, with the Russians and the Wettin dynasty later with Catherine the Great and all these different kind of combinations that happened there. So the German king was unpopular. He was very weak. Poland basically couldn't say no to Russia. And so, for example, every time a parliament would get together, they would have, Russian guys with their rifles or whatever standing outside to make sure that the votes went one particular way or another. So the last, 100, 250 years or so of the nation was a period of decline. And how much was from their own fault versus external interference versus, just kind of, so to speak, accidents of history, I think is a kind of a really kind of complicated question. So, for example, a lot of people use this metaphor: did Poland commit suicide or was she murdered? Right? And the people who are romantics say, oh, she was murdered, plucked from her prime. She was,
the
on
Christ
the
of
verge,
nations.
Yeah, on the verge of having this free constitution and on the verge of being successful. And all the other people say, well, she was stupid and disorganized and, committed suicide from her own ignorance and arrogance, right? And so I kind of take the side that maybe a little bit more romantic in that kind of a sense. But I think a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of the histories of Poland, were written by Germans or Russian authors. So when you're occupied, and for 200, so the occupation was 100, I think, from 123 years, right, from 1795 to 1918. When the only historians who were writing about you for 123 years were talking about, Poland deserved to be conquered. She was a weak state. They had all these problems. Is that really true, or is that kind of the winners writing history? so to speak. I think is kind of problematic. So so the nobles, and I think one of also the problems we say, well, it's the fault of the nobles because if only Poland had a really strong king, they would have been able to resist. So you see, kind of Norman Davies and some of those guys says, oh, all these internal problems of Poland was really really strong. What they forget is if you have a really really strong king, really really strong kings have a habit of raising armies and then trying to fight other people. So even if Poland had a really powerful king, there's a good chance Poland would have gone into trouble because that's basically what the Vasa dynasty did anyway. He got kicked out of Sweden for being too absolutist and being too strong. He made all the Polish nobles mad, and then what he did is he and his children, the Vasa dynasty, continued to try to retake Sweden, which at the time was a more powerful, bigger, stronger country then. So they pissed off Sweden and they pissed off Russia. So in that sense, the absolutist or quasi-absolutist ambitions of the Vasa kings actually were bad. And if the nobles had just let them do whatever they wanted, it could have been even worse for Poland instead of having some kind of check against the king's power. So it's kind of hard to say all these historical kind of counterfactuals. You can't prove one way or another, but I would just kind of caution, the historiography is not an even playing field. And even a lot of Polish people today were like, oh, well, Poland was weak or whatever. And it's like, well, have you really?
Not really.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I try to have two main audiences for my work. One of them is to convince Polish people that all these kinds of myths of their own history are wrong, and that they should look at because a lot of people say, oh, well, what do we care about Polish guys who died 200 some odd years ago? And I say, well, yeah, but a lot of you have all this heritage, all these really fascinating ideas today, which kind of an injustice of history have kind of been overshadowed or forgotten or erased, right, in some cases. And then the other audience, the second audience, is to convince Polish people that their own history is worth studying and reading and researching and learning lessons for contemporary constitutional law and politics today. And the second audience is to convince non-Polish people that Poland wasn't a chaotic state that just got blown up by Russia, and because its own nobles were more interested in having nice hats and balls and fancy parties, whatever, that they kind of did it to themselves. And so that's the two audiences I try to approach with my work.
But there's still some features that were kind of problematic in the Polish constitution during the Commonwealth era. And I'm going to talk to you about the one that I consider to be particularly exemplary, especially when you come to consider how countries like in Latin America, they get to have something very similar that just jeopardizes everything. And that's the liberum veto that the Polish nobility had. So they could just disrupt the parliamentary sessions. They could just disrupt the powers of the king, and that actually promoted that the fact that that the nobles would just try to raise their armies, raise any kind of confederation, just call for a parliamentary session somewhere else. The liberum veto was kind of also the reason there was no true governance as it happened in the neighboring empires, in which nobility had not that kind of power. So maybe you could try to explain more what liberum veto really was, because I mean the expression Polish Parliament, which by the way I think it's German, it kind of gets into how things are run somewhere else. And I can only think of Latin America when you get a Polish Parliament situation.
Yeah. So a little bit, I think it's kind of misunderstood somewhat where it kind of came from. And so liberum veto was actually created by the nobles against the Vasa dynasty, right? So that kind of brings the problem where you had this Vasa dynasty that were trying to force all these changes that the nobles didn't want. And so at some kind of sense, it's like, because Poland had a series of, they call them rokosz or rebellions against kings, where sometimes the king overextends his boundaries and the nobility would rise up, because there was the clause in the Polish constitution that, if the king ever oversteps his boundary, kind of this like Lockean sense of the right to rebel, right? And so I think in some sense, the liberum veto was like a parliamentary rokosz because they didn't want to rebel in a war, but it was kind of a last resort mechanism against the policies of a king, right? And so we could say, the liberum veto caused chaos, but it's like, well, yes, but what was the alternative, right? And so because it's kind of interesting if you actually look at how many times the liberum veto was used. Very often, it was actually used in times there was already kind of the civil war brewing in Poland, or there are times that were already chaotic. So it's like, it's the chicken or the egg? It's like, did the liberum veto create the chaos, or was the liberum veto a reflection of a kind of a unity and chaos, disunity and chaos that was kind of already there? Right. So if you kind of look at the case of the United States today, people say, "Oh yeah, the filibuster, is such a bad thing. It stops debate. It makes it so nothing could ever get done in Washington." It's like, well, is it actually the filibuster that's causing the problems in Washington, or is it the fact that 50% of the country hates whatever party is in power and whatever party is going on? So when the Republicans are not in power, they use the filibuster to stop the Democrats, and when the Democrats are not in power, they use the filibuster to stop the Republicans, right? So I think that's kind of a way to think of the liberum veto. Yes, there were cases, for example, when foreign kings would bribe nobles to kind of break the parliament and kind of use liberum veto. But as you mentioned before, one of the solutions they actually had was the idea of confederatia. And what was important about confederatia is that there actually was no liberum veto. And so all of Confederatia was everything was decided by majority rule. So, for example, if Parliament couldn't get things going, the nobles would kind of have a rebellion. Sometimes it was the king and a bunch of nobles would actually ally together against another part of the nobles, and they would create Confederatia, which was kind of like, you know, two informal parliaments or multiple informal parliaments fighting against each other, where they actually had majoritarian rule. And what's interesting about Confederatia is it was actually voluntary for you to join, right? So you could kind of go or stay as long as you wanted, but if you were part of the Confederatia, you had to accept the majority rule. So it's like either accept majority voting or get out of the Confederatia, right? And so we actually saw under the Veton times and as well as later on, lots of these confederations being increasingly used, right? So, I think some degree, because I think some degrees the liberum veto was symptomatic of greater problems that were going on, rather than the facilitator of things like that. And all of the kings, so like the last king of Poland, right, August Poniatowski, and all the reformers recognized that the liberum veto should not be used, and they eventually got rid of it. But if you look at the political literature of the 17th century, a lot of the discussions going on was about how and when the liberum veto should be used versus when it should not be used. So basically, everybody recognized that if you want to have a politics by consensus, a consensus of nobility, you had to respect the right of each individual nobleman to dissent. But some of them actually had political treatises. It's like, okay, well, today we would say like this is a constitutional question versus a political question, right? And so kind of this like Buchanan kind of esque problem where they would say we can use the liberum veto only for constitutional questions, but practical questions like raising the army to defend the country should actually be exempted from the liberum veto, right? And so even when you got to the 17th to the 18th century, they had this thing that's like liberum veto could not be used for tax policy or raising the military or something like that. So it's like how and why the liberum veto was used, how frequently it was used, limitations put upon it, kind of vary actually quite a lot based on what time period you're actually looking at. So it's I don't have a one size question fits all for you, but we also have to think about too, you know, Poland actually had a system where they had local parliaments, and the local parliaments would elect representatives that would go to a central parliament, and so they actually had a liberum veto, which would break the central parliament. But they also had another institution, which was this idea of a recess, and the recess would say, "We can't have consensus today. We're going to postpone it to the next meeting of the next meeting of the parliament, and if the same guys, it would be the same guys over and all over again. So it was a kind of a mechanism to actually try to create these kind of discourse. And so, for example, these little local governments actually had an institution called the instructia, or the instructions, where they would tell the people, their representatives, how to vote. And so sometimes some of them said, look, we don't like the German king, so no matter what he does, veto it. And if you have a situation like that, nothing can get done, right? But that's again, liberum veto was also very kind of tied to, regional politics, right? So it's kind of like today, if the state of California elects this very powerful, very super liberal, senator, and basically the senator says, no matter what the Republicans do, I'm going to disagree with it. Well, we don't have a mechanism in the United States today of stopping that from happening either. Or also, this is kind of a problem, I think, just with voting systems in general, right? How to balance the view of an individual to dissent versus the will of the majority. And for me, these kind of questions about this internal dialogue about when to use the veto, how to use the veto, when is it appropriate, should there be limitations on it, is really kind of fascinating within, constitutional political economy literature to really kind of look at, because we see the exact same problems today, for example, in the EU, in NATO, at the UN Security Council, right, where no one can stop Russia or China. Kind of like the EU has the problem where they try to punish Hungary and Poland blocks it, or they try to punish Poland and then Hungary blocks it, right? Or the case of NATO expansion. Well, Turkey doesn't like Sweden for whatever reason, so they can just hold the process basically forever, and we don't have a mechanism to kind of break that. So this problem of a liberal veto or a filibuster or whatever you want to call it is kind of a deep problem, I think, within constitutional thought and within parliamentary proceduralism kind of in general. And I think it's, there are a lot of lessons we actually can learn from Lithuania, even though that they failed. Because I think that's also something too important to think about is we kind of have this idea like, oh, well, the country was failing, the nobles didn't do anything, they could just kind of let it collapse because they all wanted to have their garden parties at their estates. That's actually not true. There was a lot of significant people who tried to have reforms and they failed for various reasons, right? And so I think there's a lot of lessons to learn from the kind of dialogue that they had, where they couldn't find an alternative consensus, but that doesn't mean that they didn't know that there was a problem and they weren't trying to solve it.
Well, another thing I kind of realized is that the Polish nobility elected one of their own in time of crisis instead of relying to foreign dynasties. And I can think of the guy who was elected after the Vasa, the guy who was elected for the Ottoman invasions, Jan Sobieski, the father of, well, the guy who later became Duke of Lorraine, and finally Stanislas Poniatowski, which is the final king. I mean, the final crisis with the final partition that was on him. But on all of these cases, there was a Polish king that was elected, like a Polish member of the nobility, instead of just relying on the Vasa or the Wettings or any French candidate or German candidate that could appear. So I wanted to ask you about that, because that's one of the cool characteristics of the electoral system in the Golden Freedoms, that the nobility at certain moments they would know that they had to rely on their own to run the thing and to run the country, instead of trying to just outsource that
Yeah.
into the rest of Europe.
Yeah, so I think a lot of, if you actually look at the constitutional texts or the things from the same, the laws they passed, this kind of issue of how much power should the foreigners have was present actually all the way almost from the beginning, right? Uh, Even for the problem, right, the Lithuanian king, and that's also the interesting thing if we think about Jadwiga. Well, Jadwiga was part Hungarian, right? So because her father was, there's a union between Poland and Hungary, right? And he didn't have a son; he had a daughter, and so he gave the Polish nobles freedom if they would elect his daughter as basically, they didn't have they elected her kind of as a king, right? But they really meant the idea of like a sovereign or something like that. So it's all the way kind of present from the very beginning. And so I think, in some sense, the lesson of Henry Valois, right, and the failure of the Henrician Articles was a big, or Henryk Wołyzie, as they call him in Poland, was kind of problematic. Because if you look at the next king, right, Báthory basically was Hungarian, but he had to marry, a member of the Jagiellonian dynasty who was unmarried, right? So he had to marry basically into the Polish Roman family, royal family, and because Hungary was so close to Poland at the time, there are actually a lot of similar structures with limited king and electoral votes of representatives in Hungary at the time. So it's kind of an easy sell for him, though, even though he was a foreigner, right? And then they had the failures of the Vasa kind of situation, and then the Wettin. We had Leszczynski and Wettin kind of had the civil war going back and forth, who was the king, right? And then one of them got exiled to France, and the other one kind of ended up being a puppet state of Germany, of Prussia and Russia. And so, it's kind of a really interesting question. Would they have been more stable if they had adopted other people? But for example, like the fear of the Habsburgs was a driving thing that actually united the nobility in Poland together. In a lot of the reforms that they made up through the Henrician Articles. And that's why they wanted an elected king in the first place. That's also why they wanted, a lot of the reforms that Jan Kazimierz II, the last Vasa king, was trying to do is he wanted to have a vivente rege election, which is the idea that the king has the election for the next king while the one king is still alive. And the nobles said, no, 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 that's not, that's totally against the law because the king has to die, and then the nobles have to kind of find a new king. Like a job search, kind of had to go out, so to speak, to find the next king, right? And so he wanted to put a French guy on the throne, right? So it's fear of the Habsburgs, fear of this throughout the entire history of Poland, and of course later on, fear of the czars was also a big driver for it. So but the other interesting thing is that Sobieski and Korybut before him, a lot of these guys, they were Polish, but a lot of them were kind of from the frontier, so to speak. So, for example, the Sobieski family, I think it was his grandfather or something, was actually Polish Ukrainian and originally an Orthodox, and then their family had converted to Catholicism, and so it's kind of like, yes, they were Poland, but even they were kind of I guess what I'm trying to get to is that, yes, they elected Polish kings because they're suspicious of foreigners, but there was not really a kind of a central identity of Polishness as there kind of is today, right? So you had Lithuanian guys who were sometimes call themselves Lithuanians, sometimes they call themselves Polish. You had guys who were born in Ukraine, but if they spoke Polish and they were Catholic, right? So it's kind of a really interesting kind of question because there are so many internal dynamics, and the country was so large, right? Because by the time of the 17th century, it was second only to Russia in terms of size of European countries, right? So it was so big in terms of culture and so big of space that I think they saw this idea where they had enough citizenry and enough kind of diversity that they didn't need to have a foreign kind of king come in to stabilize them. And actually, one of the ideas of the kings that the Polish had is that they had all these nobles who all could vote. And so under the law, they were all equal with each other. And so they saw the only reason to kind of break the deadlock. So, for example, nobles didn't like it when they would go to court because they say, like, you don't have a right to sue me, right? Because we're equal on the same kind of playing field, so to speak. So that's why they needed the person of the king to kind of be the manager of these nobles, right? So he'd be like, they would elevate. And so that's why they had this idea at the end of elevating one of their own kind of at the top, kind of this, like a promotion, I guess, kind of from within the system. And a lot of people basically say towards the end, Poniatowski was kind of more like a president for life than actually kind of a king in a sense, as we think of hereditary monarchy and dynasty, because he himself didn't have any children, right? And so he also was setting conditions in the 3rd of May Constitution for what the next dynasty kind of. So just like as in 1569, right, we're going to have an election in 1573, and that's where the Warsaw Confederation, all of Henry's articles came from. We see the same parallels happening in 1791 when they were planning for the next dynasty too. And I think it was the Elector of Saxony or something like that was, they already predetermined who was, going to be the next.
Yeah, I think it would have been either them, the Vettings again, or maybe the Czartoryski family, because the Czartoryskis were quite powerful at the end of the Commonwealth. And I mean, living in Krakow, I kind of get the whole influence of the Czartoryskis, because not only they were based in here, but thereafter, I mean, that's not really your research topic, but there are these cases of like Polish surviving states, the free city of Krakow, for instance, and how the Czartoryski, especially Adam Jerzy, who was a friend of Emperor Alexander of Russia, he had like a very prominent role in drafting the constitution of the city and almost getting to be its first president, so to speak. He was the first senator. So you have all of these parallels, and you have all of these elements in Polish constitutional history that get to be very misunderstood outside of Poland. Well, maybe in Central Europe they get to know. I think the Hungarians are very, very knowledgeable about Polish history, for instance. But when it comes to American analysts mostly, and Russian analysts, if you take the other side, they don't really seem to know about the place they are dealing with.
Yeah, and I think, not to get too much into kind of contemporary politics, when they had the situation about the controversy where you can't say Polish concentration camps or whatever, right? And then Obama came to Poland and he had a speech where he said, Polish concentration camps, and my professors even, and my peers at the university today say, "Oh yeah, I can't believe that he did that," and that was like 10 years ago, right? So I think a lot of the issues that Poland has, like, it's hard for us to kind of understand, coming from outside of that. And so they do have this, problematic, because, a lot of people I know say, "Oh, Polish people, those are basically like kind of like Russians," right? And it's like, no, Polish people actually don't want to be compared. That's like the last people that, Poles actually want to be compared to. But from your average American, I would imagine probably similar in South America, as well. They're like, "Oh yeah, those Slavs are kind of all the same," and it's like, no, they're really not. It is, But one of the interesting things, as well, kind of to talk about kind of Polish history, kind of from Krakow, was right. Krakow was the original capital of Poland, right? And then it predates Warsaw by 800 years or whatever. And then towards the end of it, there was a shift towards Warsaw, right, as or Warszawa, right, as they call it, right, capital of Poland. So I think there was kind of this like old nobility versus young kind of nobility, maybe kind of tension going on, because, for example, the father of the Third May Constitution, Hugo Kołłątaj, him and Staszic, right, they were pro-bourgeoisie. They wanted a very urban model of the city, right, and Warsaw was kind of a very urban kind of quote unquote new city, and it's kind of, there was this tension of the Czartoryski family and all these other allies who were kind of these gentlemen, landed gentlemen of the nobility, didn't like these new up and coming city folk, changing the way that Poland was, right? And so I think that's also kind of an interesting kind of tension, the shift between Krakow towards Warsaw, and has continued more or less today, right? And so that you also see this kind of tension, right, between like the universities. So again, the University of Krakow was like kind of like the Oxford of Poland, right, where they were creating like 1280 or whatever, and they don't like those newfangled up and comers from the University of Warsaw. So even in the institutions, there's this kind of Krakow Warsaw rivalry that we even see today. And the other
Yeah.
thing, Yeah, yeah,
I was going to tell you that still up to date, you have this kind of rivalry, but it's not. Well, I would even say it's kind of political because you see that the south and the east of Poland tend to be more conservative than the more
yeah,
closer to Germany parts of the country. I mean, Warsaw, Poznań, uh, Wrocław, they tend to be quite a progressive and liberal
yeah,
centers, whereas Krakow, Lublin, they tend to be more along the lines of, I mean, I would say peace. I wouldn't say Confederacja because Confederacja is complicated these days.
yeah, yeah. What it stands for? Yeah.
Yeah, but go ahead. Maybe one last question because it's we're already over the hour. Uh,
Okay, sure.
yeah, I mean, I'm trying to get some general sense of the Polish Commonwealth and of all of its conclusions and developments, especially in the later parts, that could be influential in other countries. You know that Tadeusz Kościuszko, who was an important figure in both the American independence, he
Right.
also participated in insurrections in Higgins, Americans, and people who participated in other parts of the war. Few of Poniatowski, Joseph Poniatowski, he was a marshal in Napoleon's army. So maybe that's one of the main ideas that I would like to discuss at the end, and it's how Poland may have influenced the rest of the world in their political development. Because we kind of see the influence of English and French thought, but we don't really talk about Polish influence. And that
Yeah,
could be a shame. I mean, I talk about maybe the US because it would be an easier way to follow. But I mean, in Latin America, we have similar institutions, even though we have no connection to Poland whatsoever. So it's kind of, just paths developing in the same way over time.
yeah. So I don't know if I could speak too much for Latin America or other parts, but for example, we know that there's a significant amount of influence back and forth between Polish thought and American thought for the 1787 Constitution in America and the 1791 Constitution. For example, the Federalist Papers mentions Poland as an example of what not to do. And Stashitz and Kowantai write, and they said, we would love to do what America did, but the problem is we don't have an ocean to separate us from our enemies. So we have to be more centralized than even they would have wanted. Right? So that was certainly kind of problematic. I think there, other course, is, Kosciuszko had a great friendship with Thomas Jefferson. And so, Kosciuszko was, we kind of think of Jefferson kind of as a liberal at his time, but Kosciuszko was even further then because he wanted, emancipation of everybody, right? So he was against slavery, and he tried to convince Jefferson to give up slaves and all these kinds of, ideas like this. And so uh, there is a lot of kind of back and forth within constitutional thought that I think legacy is still to discover for Poland. So, for example, and this is kind of one of the things I'm actually working on now. One of the things I'm trying to do is trying to revive it, so to speak. Of course, uh, a lot of Poland, I think, it wasn't in terms of political thought, but a lot of the culture, right? Especially you go to like the American Midwest, right? There's, Chicago's kind of like the holy, like the promised land. I talk to Polish people today, they're like, oh man, I wish I was in Chicago.
Yeah.
No, not really. You really don't want to go there. It's not 1870 anymore. It's not what you think it is. Uh, and of course, for example, I just learned this recently that I think it's the largest mountain in Australia is called Mount Kosciuszko. So how that ended up, it's kind of an interesting story. Yeah, there. And, of course, also something to think about is that Burke also has some writings about Poland, right? And but he has reflections on the French, right? People always know about that, his comparison of kind of the French and the American revolutions. He also writes about Poland and, the great injustice that was done to Poland and, some potentials, Montesquieu. Montesquieu has, in his Spirit of Laws, he has discussions about Poland, right? And, it's whether he was pro-Poland or anti-Poland is a little bit complicated to kind of talk about. There's actually a really interesting book that people want to be interested. It's called The Invention of Eastern Europe by Larry Wolff, and he basically, and his section, it's about all of Eastern Europe, and his basic thesis is what traditionally Europe was north versus south in terms of, because of political geography, where you had the Catholic south, the Catholic and Roman south, and you had the Germanic and Protestant north. And he said sometime around the advent of the Enlightenment, it shifted between east and west. And so he has this whole idea that, for example, Voltaire hated Poland and was very anti-Poland. Of course, Voltaire was a great fanboy, so to speak, of Frederick the Great of Prussia as well as Catherine the Great. They were pen pals, right? And he actually has letters. He says, "Yeah, you take over those ignorant Polish savages, show them what's for." So the main historiographer of Eastern Europe was pro-Russian, right? So that's kind of a problematic, the whole conception of Eastern Europe as barbarian and Western Europe as civilized, because Catholic the Great and Frederick the Great, of course, were copying, French absolutism. So of course they're enlightened despots in the sea of ignorance and all these things like that. So I think there is a lot of that to kind of be undone, so to speak. But no, there's a whole fascinating actual series of newspaper articles, for example, going on where during the American Revolution they were talking about, the Warsaw Gazette and all these things like that. They were talking about, America, the American Revolution, and how great it was, and America was a symbol of freedom, and all these things like that. And Americans, vice versa, that Washington. I don't know if he wrote to him directly, but he had some statements about Poniatowski and how great a man he was, and like how he was looking forward to that. So I think, in terms of the American Revolution, I think there is a lot there to really kind of be fleshed out and really discovered. But past then, I don't know. I wouldn't claim to be an expert on the Napoleonic part of Europe, right? But I would imagine, so it was a kind of interesting thing where actually Kosciuszko was an exile in Switzerland, and he actually, I don't know if he met him in person, but he knew about Napoleon towards the end of his life, and Napoleon tried to convince him. He's like, "Oh, you are the great liberator. You should join forces with me." And Kosciuszko was like, "Guys, this guy's bad news. You think he's good now, but it's going to go bad for you." Right, and so Kosciuszko has his connections with Napoleon as well, and Poland were great supporters of Napoleon and his special war against Russia. So I would imagine something to look into would be, from 1795 through 1820, this interaction between French and Polish political thought. I would imagine that's an area probably to look into as well. But like I said, I'm not an expert. I kind of have this gap where I started in the 20th century, and then I kind of jumped to the 12th century, and then worked my way up to the 18th century. So maybe one day or in the future, I'll kind of connect those two dots. But I do have this kind of gap there, so I don't want to say anything that's inaccurate. But as I kind of mentioned before, I think there are a lot of lessons we can still learn. For example, kind of maybe end with this, where we talked about this instructia, the instructions that they gave. Well, uh, Kollontai and Stashitz basically argued more or less that, in kind of this Rousseauian manner, that the instructions were the way to make sure that the electors to the Sejm kept with the general will. And so they actually wanted the instructions to be legally binding. So, for example, we have a lot of these situations in parliamentary systems today where, like, what happens if you elect somebody and then he or she goes, and the national parliament does something that you don't want to do, right? Very few countries have like a system of referendum where it's like, oh well, he voted something, we didn't like it, let's have a local vote and retract that person as a senator. Or and then also kind of this interesting questions we have in the United States, but there's all these court cases about faithless electors, and are there mechanisms to kind of ensure, for example, like what would the parliament of Brussels look like if every time the representatives, in Brussels passed something that the people at home didn't like. Should there be more of this kind of, and so Stasic and Kalanta actually talk about there should be mechanisms that local parliaments have at the local level, or at the national versus the international level in the case of the EU, to actually constrain the legislature. So that could be something, of late Polish Lithuanian constitutional thought, political thought, that I am interested in. It's kind of on my to-do list of things to kind of look into actually in the future. So I think there are a lot of lessons that we can still learn, even though that they failed, right? And especially the guys who, because we read about the winners, we don't read about the losers. So there were lots of guys who had all these ideas of how to reform in the 18th century, in the 17th century, in the 16th century, the 15th century, who were on the losing side. And it's kind of interesting and fun finding kind of thought experiment that's like, oh, what if they had made these reforms in 1715 or whatever? Would history have gone a different way? So it's kind of unanswerable, but kind of interesting to hypothesize about.
Well, that was a great way to end the discussion, especially because there are practical approaches and practical proposals that could be taken from the history and the traditional and historical development of Polish Lithuania and of the Golden Freedoms and of the Commonwealth. So thank you, Patrick. It was great talking to you, especially because this topic is not really well understood outside of Poland, and you're really one of the first people I have like true knowledge that they come to Poland to study about this. My case is very tangential to this because I'm studying comparative law. But you really came to Poland to study about the Commonwealth. I get to know about the Commonwealth and the Golden Freedoms and, related stuff like the Free City of Krakow because of, I just like to learn stuff. But you actually came here to learn about it. And maybe some last words about the place you do your research and your work, because, Łódź, it's kind of an overrated city in Poland. And there's also the Alexis de Tocqueville Center in which you work here in Poland. So maybe something to say about that.
Yeah, so I work at it's called the Alexis de Tocqueville Center for Political and Legal Thought. Basically, the last 10 years or so, and especially since I've been here, the big project has been this gap where in the 16th and 17th century, Polish political philosophers, they wrote in Latin, and they've never been translated even into Polish. So they're actually reviving these political tracts and letters and things like that, and kind of filling in that gap within Polish kind of thought. That's kind of been the big project here at the de Tocqueville Center. And my other kind of hat that I wear is that we have this Center for the Anglo-American Legal Tradition, which has just kind of started up here also at the University of Łódź, and that's where going to be looking to translate English and American constitutional documents from the 15th, 16th, 17th century into Polish and kind of introduce that into contemporary political discourse in Poland. And of course, I also work as this interdisciplinary scholar for the Center for American Studies, which is based in Poznań. So I have connections in Łódź as well as Poznań. But my academic home is here at the University of Łódź and the de Tocqueville Center. They kind of were the ones who invited me over, who I mostly collaborate with. But I'm always looking for people who are interested in this, and so I'm always looking for potential collaborators and co-conspirators to try to bring Polish, and it's not just historical, but like you said, this practical way. What can we actually learn to not just this was nice, let's just do a pure historical way. It's not like an art piece on a wall. It's an actual practical research program. What solutions did they have? How do they work? Why did they not work? Can we learn from them? Can we adjust for them today? So if anybody's interested in that, I don't just write exclusively on Poland. I also write about kind of contemporary law and constitutional thought in general as well. So that's it for me. So I really had a great time So maybe we can do this again in the future. We're both. I don't know how long you're going to be in Poland, or if you're going to be like me in Poland forever, right? But
Hopefully.
medium to long term. It's funny because of course, last name Higgins. I'm Irish, right? So people are like, oh yeah, you're in Poland, so your wife must be Polish, or your dad must be Polish. Nope. And when I came to Poland, I knew pierogi and kielbasa, and those were the only two words that I knew. And all the rest of it I had to figure out on my own, wandering around, fighting through the post-communist bureaucracy and immigration and all these things like that, because I'm a non-EU foreigner. So, like, what do we do with this guy, Because it's like I'm a unicorn, a non-EU foreigner who's trying to learn Polish, So it's like, kind of wild stuff.
We kind of sort it out, to be honest. But yeah, the first words we learn in Polish are usually pierogi and kielbasa, as well as, meko, jabłko.
Yeah.
The basic stuff to it.
Yeah, my first phrase was, nie jestem, nie wiem. It's like, unfortunately, I don't know. And that was my answer to anytime somebody would come up to me. It's like, I said, I don't know. Leave me alone. I have no idea what's going on, So.
Right. Let's see. For now, I'm just finishing like part 1 of my studies in comparative law. I'll see what goes next. Poland is really a beautiful country. From España and Navarra Confidencial, we have plenty of connections to Poland. My friend and producer, Angel Garcia, he goes to Lublin every now and then. He has connections with the liberal conservative association that is based in Lublin. Our founder, Adolfo Lustiza, he does investments in Warsaw. Me, like, I am the host of this program. I'm a frequent contributor to the newspaper. I'm based in Krakow, so we're also Polonia Confidencial at this point.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I would say, unfortunately, I have not been to the southeast corner of Poland yet. I've been, towards the northwest, the northern part, and all of the border with Germany and parts of the south, but I have not been.
The former German partition, you were up to Gdansk.
Yeah. So my wife's family is actually German, and they were living in the Silesian part. So it's kind of like, my wife might have been a German who was living here in Poland, or her grandparents were. So we kind of have a connection, but it's kind of like, oh yeah, my wife's from one of the country that was occupying you. You don't bring that up. It's of the parts of conversation. But yeah, it's a great country. So and Łódź is great too. A lot of people are like, oh, Łódź, you bet. Because Łódź is young, right? We were created as a city. It was created, during the industrial age with all the factories. It's kind of like Detroit of Poland, right? All these big factories and stuff here. You don't have any fancy castles or no kings were there. Yeah, but we've got this stuff here, Come visit us. We're in the middle of the country, so I'm basically equidistant, for every other major, other city, right, more or less, smack in the middle of the country. So it's a great geographical location. All the major highways, and byways cross here. So it's a good place to set up a camp if you want to travel around the country, and which I've been over the years slowly circling around, trying to familiarize myself.
Well, thank you again, Patrick. It was great having you. I hope to see you soon, especially given that you're presenting your PhD thesis in very short. So
yes,
thank you. Congratulations, and I'll see you soon. Thank you, everyone.
All the best. Take care. Just give me a break.